Okay, all right, I'm going to start. Um, so this is Lyman Stone, who is a demographer, and I think I'll start out by asking about your demography. So where and when were you born?
Uh, I was born May 13th, 1991, the day after Mother's Day. Um, and I was born in a hospital that is a mile away from where I currently sit in Lexington, Kentucky. Um, uh, so yeah, I was born in Kentucky, and I have recently returned to Kentucky about a year ago after a decade in DC, Hong Kong, and Montreal.
Okay. How many brothers and sisters did you have?
I am the youngest of three. I have a brother or I have a sister who's 4.5 years older, and a brother who's 5.5 years older.
And did you go to public school or private school?
I was public school all the way from kindergarten to graduation. And then I did do a private liberal arts for my undergrad, um, uh, because they paid me to go there.
What?
So it was Transylvania University. It's actually the oldest university west of the Appalachian Mountains. But unlike a lot of the other old universities that got big, Transylvania handed over all of its spin-off schools to other institutions. So our agricultural school became the University of Kentucky. We had another school, our law school became Centre College. We just spun off other institutions instead of becoming large. So.
Okay. Um, okay, and the Montreal was McGill University for
That's right. So I'm ABD now. I am just writing my dissertation. But yes, I am doing my PhD at McGill University. So the Anglophone university, the better Anglophone university in Montreal.
although
So
it's still like more left wing than the Ivy League, right? As a whole.
you know, I mean, Canada on the whole is, and Quebec certainly in its own way is, but the sociology department in McGill that I'm in, I doubt that there's anybody who, I mean, obviously there's no Trump voters because it's Canadians, but even if it were in the US, I doubt any of them would be Trump voters. Um, but it was a place definitely where kind of the old small L liberal ideas of tolerance and pluralism um, definitely are believed by the faculty in that department. So it
Okay.
was no problem that I was conservative. So
Okay.
I
Oh,
never got any grief for it.
okay. All right. Um, and a little bit more demographics. When did you get married?
I got married on Pi Day, the closest approximation of it that will be around for a century, 31415. And instead of cake, we had pie and we cut it at 9:26 p.m. So 31415,926, right? Um, so I got married in Ashland, Kentucky, which is where my wife is from. So what is that? I'm coming up on 10 years in 2 months.
And you have some children, right?
I do. I have three children, three daughters who I guess we had to schedule this conversation a bit later than typical because I had to put them down for bed. Um, so yeah, I have one who just turned 5, one who just turned 3, and one who is almost 16 months old.
Okay. And did you make all of them sleep on their back?
We attempted. But they all like all of my children, we'd like, especially with the first one, you're very careful with your first child, right? So we like set her down and swaddled her properly and put her down on her back. And then as soon as she was able to roll, she would just roll over onto her belly. And the other ones we realized is the same, that we put them down on their back and they roll over onto their belly. And we would just tell ourselves, you know, SIDS is a syndrome, not a disease. SIDS is a syndrome, not a disease, right? It's a label you apply after the fact. It's not a cause. So we would just
Actually,
tell ourselves that and be happy. So
yeah. Well, it's one of my pet peeves is the advice to have put kids on their back. But anyway, I won't go into my rant on that. I have plenty of other things I can rant about.
yeah.
Okay, so the main issue I want to talk about with you is the worldwide fertility decline.
Mhm.
And one of the things about it is that sort of every explanation for it, if you look either internationally or maybe even, in different uh, sort of different groupings within the United States, you can find some exception to a theory.
Hmm.
Um, and so, like, one theory is that it's all about economic growth. It's every country as it develops, once it develops, there, for whatever reason, becomes a preference for fewer children.
Hmm.
What are the exceptions to that? Either undeveloped that are
Hmm.
having fertility declines or developed that are not?
So there are so many exceptions to that that the exceptions outnumber the cases. So the problem here, and I'm going to be referring here some to this post that I wrote a couple of weeks ago, walking through some of the theories that I think are good for explaining a lot of change over time in fertility around the world, but that are maybe a little less popularly known. So the problem is we all look at a cross-sectional graph, right? We all say, look, it's very clear that higher income countries have lower fertility. I mean, that's true cross-sectionally. Um, if you respecify your cross-sectional graph as a panel model, right? So longitudinal change over time in a country instead of cross-section, the negative effect of GDP growth is cut by about 2/3. So you eliminate most of the effect. If then you just add in um, uh, basically time effects, so like linear change over time or time fixed effects, which there's actually a great paper that just finally like officially published, I think this month, all about like how spatial economics goes wrong. And the main thing is basically most spatial economics findings do not replicate if you correctly add in basically just underlying time trends, right? So if you do that, which you should do, um, the coefficient on GDP is actually positive. That is, when places get richer, they have more babies. Now, that seems counterintuitive when you think about it as places becoming richer. But if instead you think about it as, okay, do people have more babies during recessions or during economic boom times? And the answer is boom times. They have more babies in those times. Um, so if you realize that, well, recessions are bad for babies, then you start saying, okay, so then what does it we really mean if we don't actually mean like shocks to people's income? What does it we really mean by growth? Well, we mean something else. So then people say, well, it's education. Um, and education is pretty strongly correlated, more strongly correlated than GDP in cross-section or in panel regressions than GDP is.
Can I ask you,
Yeah,
is that if you separate out women's education, because that's really one theory,
hmm,
is that once women become educated,
yeah,
then you're going to get your big fertility decline. How does that
yeah.
theory, what are the exceptions to that theory?
So educating anyone matters. And in fact, the best evidence. So there's a very cool study out of Nepal where we have this very unusual data set in Nepal where there's this one valley, part of a valley really, that had very little human settlement. It had a group of hunter-gatherers in it, but other than that, it had no sedentary agriculturalists. Um, but in the 50s, they killed all the tigers, sprayed DDT, drained the swamps, and opened it up for farming. And it became like the Iowa of Nepal, like the new frontier of Nepal. Like everybody moved there who wanted to like get ahead in life. So it was this very like upwardly mobile society. And the great thing is the government started collecting data immediately. So we have like from day one of sedentary human habitation in this valley, we know everything. We know every road that ever existed, every electricity line that was ever laid. We know internet coverage of everywhere the whole time. Um, and we know every school that ever existed in this valley, and we know who their teachers were, what the curriculums were that they taught, all this stuff. And what we find is when people grow up close to a school, or even when they live close to a school in early adulthood, they have lower fertility. And that is true whether they themselves get educated or not. That is, mere proximity to school reduces fertility, not just your own education. And that really strongly suggests, and by the way, we can see this most clearly in Nepal because Nepal is where we have this really unique contextual data. But when you start looking under the hood at a lot of studies that look at like um, kind of regression discontinuity designs looking at school expansions in a lot of Africa, you start to see a similar thing that like, yeah, expanding schooling always reduces fertility, but like when you start to look at mechanisms like, oh, it's like changed earning potential, or oh, it's changed matching, or oh, it's changed information, none of the mechanisms are consistent across country. We have no consistent mechanism. And then you realize it's not any of these mechanisms, it's just schooling itself. And what I mean by schooling itself is that basically schooling is a vector for a change in the parent-child relationship, a change in the channels children have for status, a change in the kind of cost-benefit calculation that a child is for a parent, um, and a change in the kind of ways that a parent can extract wealth from their child. And ultimately, schooling becomes a vector for developmental idealism, which is an ideology that is so pervasive that we all swim in it and we hardly even notice it's there. And I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but basically, schooling, when you can separate it from developmental idealism. So when you look at like religious schools or like madrasas, or there's a case where France used to have almost all of its schools staffed by like monks and nuns, and then they banned clergy. They banned um it's not clergy, there's a different word. They banned monks and nuns basically from teaching in schools, and you see like this immediate change in fertility behaviors. This is actually kind of late in France's fertility transition, but it's significant
Okay, so
nonetheless.
you tossed out this phrase developmental idealism, which I hate. I hate that as a term. I wish you would have come up with something else. Uh, Explain what it means.
Yeah, so I didn't invent the term. And yeah, if I were going to invent a term, I don't know, maybe I'd come up with something better. But I try not to invent terms because we're so swimming in logomachy to begin with. So the idea of developmental idealism is simple. The West got rich before other places did, right? And we can all debate why that is. But there is a school of thought that Westerners in particular promoted, and there's books written on how we promoted it, how this was done, whatever. But we did, it is historic fact that colonial administrations, missionaries, nonprofit organizations, to this day, nonprofit organizations are major promoters of the idea that the source of Western wealth is our family model, that basically we taught our children to be creative and independent. We gave women, autonomy and liberty, and or we had stable nuclear families, or we didn't marry our cousins, or it's something about our family model caused our breakout growth. This is the story, and so um, if you want to be healthy, wealthy, and prosperous, like we are, you know, you should probably not have arranged marriages because that's what's really holding you back. You should probably, you know, focus on creativity rather than discipline for your children because that's what's holding you back. You should probably not have so many children because that's what's holding you back. Whatever. It's
Okay,
the
so
idea.
part of
Yeah.
this package of sort of what the sort of international elites are promoting, one part of this package is smaller families, that
Yes. Yeah.
you will be wealthier
Yeah.
and sort of more sophisticated and
Yeah.
more like the people
Yep.
that you can see on your international television
Yep.
if you have a
Yep.
smaller family.
Exactly. And this really, I mean, it's promoted by governments too around the developing world. You can still go around China or India today, even though they no longer like officially promote this, and you can find old billboards that are like, that'll say things like, two is best, join the modern revolution. And but the point is, it's couched in this language of development and modernity that is, it's not just saying like, don't have a child, you'll save, 5% on your monthly budget, right? It's that you not having a child or you participating in the Western family norm is like part of a project of modernity, part of a project of modernization, part of how we as a country are going to become modern wealthy and all these things. And I think it's, again, in the post I go through like there's all kinds of weird like cases of this that I think are fairly persuasive, but In general, we see this around the world. And now today we have survey evidence where people go into very poor countries and ask them, do you think that if you have one less child, that it will make your country richer? And like 76% of people or whatever will say yes. Huge share. In fact, developmental idealism is more widely believed in poor countries than it is in rich countries today. We don't know, who knows what a survey in 1850 would have shown, but one imagines not the same thing.
Well, one thing that's nice about the term idealism is it gets at this notion of ideas are
Yes.
driving
Yes.
change. And one of your interesting charts shows that the actual family size kind of tracks desired family size in surveys, that
Yeah.
both have been going down, so that there's a sense in which this was that this decline in fertility was intentional. But as I recall, those charts consistently show that, well, when they wanted four children, they had three. When they wanted three, they had two. So that there's
So,
something else
yeah.
going on, right?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things going on. One is this change in ideas, where people they start to aspire to be healthy, wealthy, and prosperous like the West. You can't just wish capital into being, but you can wish, a different marriage model into being or fewer children into being. And so it's in some sense the family is more portable than immediate. You can't just have better roads tomorrow, right? Material change is sticky and slow, whereas you can just have different ideas tomorrow. Ideas can move very, very rapidly. Um, so that's part of what's going on is people want the wealth, and it seems like the family model is the only lever that is accessible to them easily. Easily, it's still not easy, but it's easier. Um, and then secondly, you also have a very real improvement happening around the world in the last 100 years, and that is, well, more than 100, but especially the last 100 years, and that is falling child mortality, right? The more kids lived, and child mortality is overwhelmingly one of the strongest predictors and causal factors shaping fertility. And you can see this in lots of different cases. There's actually a really great recent study that shows that when sulfonamides, one of these early kind of antibiotic type things, were rolled out in the US in the 1930s, it caused a major change in maternal mortality and child mortality that had a lot of really interesting effects on how people bred and thought about their
But
families.
it's right pretty counterintuitive that family size should shrink as you get rid of, excess child mortality, right?
Right. But so you have to think about what's really going on. So back when people were having four kids, they said they wanted three, right? So if you look at it, it used to be that people on average were having more kids than they wanted. Today they're having fewer. So what was going on in the past is you have to make extra kids to hit, because when people say they want to have three kids, they don't mean they want to have three live births. They
Right.
mean they want to have three children that carry on their family line or family project or whatever. So you have to have extra to to hit your goal, right? And so as child mortality falls, you actually see that people really are having fewer because they don't need to have as many. Now,
But but
and we do, yeah,
but it seems like there's just been this an incredible amount of overshooting. Like if your thinking is, well, having three or more children is, sort of not modern. There's this incredible overshooting on the low side. I mean, take South Korea.
yeah,
Explain to me South Korea in your developmental
yeah.
idealism story.
So developmental idealism and child mortality, those two explain the overwhelming amount of the variation in fertility decline from, four or higher to two. Getting below two, you've got a couple of different things going on. So developmental idealism is really important for understanding Korea. If you think about the history of Korea, you basically had a dictatorship that decided that rapid industrialization and rapid development was more important than anything else. Korea had some of the most aggressive anti-family propagandizing of anywhere on the planet. Again, this is all historic record. You can go and look it up. But I mean, Korea's modern family planning campaigns were basically invented in Taiwan and Korea. Like this is where you look at old publications in the 50s and 60s on They're called CAP surveys, knowledge, attitude, and practice. And like all of them are like Jamaica or Taiwan or Korea. That's like where we tested how to persuade people not to have babies, like at a disciplinary level as demographers. Um, so Korea was an early and vigorous adopter of the idea that they would create a developmental state. And you can actually see this in the literature on like political science of development, right? That like they bought in hard to this idea that countries can escape cyclicality, they can achieve development by doing certain things. Some of those things were true, right? Make an environment that's really good for investment, guarantees investment returns, that encourages specialization for whatever your country's comparative advantage might be. This was all true. This is basically just kind of like sound economics. Have a functioning price system for land. Okay, like have a land tenure system that actually makes sense. Um, so that all was true. But in the process, I mean, the Korean government also did a lot of unusual things, right? Like they actively broke any form of labor organizing. Um, they actively suppressed any form of social or cultural identity that would be non-developmental. They actually suppressed a lot of traditional Confucian and Buddhist ideology in their own country, even though those were like long-standing parts of Korean national identity. Because they weren't developmentally useful. Like monks don't contribute to development, right? So like, why do you need them? Let's get rid of them. Like Confucian scholar elites, not really developmental. Let's get rid of them. And these were active government campaigns. Now, I'm not saying
But your point is that the campaign that mattered was the sort of anti-natalist campaign.
so. My point is that you look throughout all of this, and again, when you this is actually why the developmental idealism framework is helpful because it's not only if they'd only done the small family thing and nothing else, maybe it doesn't stick. But the point is, the small family thing is part of this overwhelming push for this idea of development, and people get the idea of development lodged in their head. And so today, if you survey Koreans, I was actually at a conference recently where they had some survey results, and they asked parents like, do you think moving to a different neighborhood to get in a more competitive school will make your child like will make their life better? Overwhelmingly, the parents said no. We think it'll make them miserable. The more competitive school will be really sad for them. It won't make them that much better off. Then they asked them, do you think that moving to a neighborhood to get this more competitive school will give your child higher income? Yes, we do. We think they'll have a better job in the future, but they'll be more miserable and sad. And then they asked them, do you plan to move to a neighborhood with a more competitive school? And like 90% of parents said yes, right? And by the way, the same survey in the US did not show as high a rate of this, right? That this was a very Korean trait of like, we are actively going to trade off our child's happiness for their income. Um, and the point is that this ethic, once you plant the seed, I mean, culture's like a tree, right? It grows very rapidly in its first few years. It spreads, it puts down roots, and then it's much harder to uproot. Okay. And it kind of takes on a life of its own. And so this developmental idealism gets very deep. And actually, Claudia Golden just published a paper that I quite disagreed with, but there is a grain of truth to it. She argued that countries that developed faster have lower fertility today. And I think it's not that they grew faster. My view of what's going on is that the countries that developed quickly, in some cases, not in all cases, but in some cases, did so partly because they had governments that were really, really aggressively, quote unquote, developmentalist. Um, Now, what's going on in Korea today, right now, is very simply that no one gets married. Korean fertility, if you do a graph of Korean fertility and Korean entrance into marriage rates, they're just the same graph. They're just one-to-one lines. It's like a 0.95 correlation or something. And this is true around the world. That when you see fertility well below 2, you are always everywhere in every case looking at a society of very, very delayed marriage and coupling. Um, and so there's kind of a different story about why marriage is
Yeah.
declining.
Well, let's
And
let's
that,
get to
yeah,
that because then we have, the example of the United States, which obviously never had to go through an ideological
yeah,
of developmental idealism of saying, we we need to have smaller
Yeah.
families in order to be modern because we were the modern country.
Yes. And we
So,
were also an early adopter of low fertility. The two societies that are if you make a map of like what places are like experiencing demographic transition, basically you have two early cultural epicenters, and they are Paris and Boston. And they both begin to experience a precocious transition well before industrialization. And it spreads slowly away from them. And then once London pivots in 1876 is the date for London, because I won't get into too much, but there is literally a date on which the fertility transition starts in London. From there, wherever the British Empire is involved, fertility starts to decline very rapidly. And then it just kind of goes based on trade patterns or linguistic similarity to French.
okay.
Trade.
So,
But
the,
what's yeah,
so in the United States, what, let's say over the last, since
yeah,
the baby boom, what
yeah,
accounts
yeah,
for the decline in marriage and fertility?
yeah. Uh, Around the world, one thing we're seeing, and actually Oded Galore has a paper, I think he calls it like a unified growth theory. But broadly, what we see around the world is that the returns to skill are increasing, right? That we're seeing skills bias technical change, where you can get more skills. You can stay in school longer and get more skills. There are opportunities for them. And you can get a lot of benefit from that, right? The upper ceiling of income is much higher than it used to be. The result of this is that young men, and then also that women's economic potential is rising dramatically. But actually, that's kind of a second story to what I'm going to focus on here, which is basically that young men's incomes are not rising. And if you look around the world, and unfortunately, I don't have data for every country, but I've looked at this at like 10 or 15 countries. I do have data for, you look over the last 30, 40 years, and what you will see is that there's been great economic growth in the long run in a lot of places, because guess what? Capitalism rocks and is amazing. But it is overwhelmingly growth for like men over the age of 30, or men over the age of 35, or men over the age of 40. Whereas men in their 20s or early 30s in many countries have seen no growth in real incomes, and in some they've seen real decline. Now, we know why that is. It's not a mystery. They're in school longer, right? Like they're in
Yeah.
school longer, right? So they have zero income. But here's the thing. That's when you get married.
Mhm.
Okay. And if you don't get married until you're 37, you're not having that many kids. Like point blank, you're just not. Unless you're very, very lucky. So what's going on is, and essentially, and again, we can see this on dating apps, we can see this all kinds of places. There's actually a great paper that this just came out recently that showed that assortative mating is actually becoming more income biased over time. That is, women are selecting men more based on income than in the past, which is interesting if your theory is that like women only want high earning men if they don't have income on their own. No, there's a complicated insurance dynamic. I've written about the insurance dynamic of marriage rather than the breadwinner dynamic elsewhere. But the point is basically um, young men are a bad economic bet. It's very difficult to figure out which young man is going to be a good husband insurer. That is a husband-based insurance plan for future care of children. And so women have to wait longer to figure out which man is going to be revealed as a good bet, right? Now they can marry an older man, but we have cultural norms that somewhat regulate against that. And crucially, what's going on is women, by and large, it's not that they are comparing men to themselves. Okay, that's not mostly what's going on. It's a complicated. Basically, what I would argue is who women are really comparing their male peers to is their fathers. And I don't mean that in like a daddy issue way. Okay, I mean that in a simpler. Fathers are setting a standard of what a husband's economic contribution to a household would look like, and maybe not even their own fathers, kind of the fathers of themselves and their peers. Okay, and young men can't measure up to that, right? Because we have a steeper age gradient of income for men than we had in the past. That's just, again, that's
Okay,
just
so that,
economic
yeah.
fact.
All right, so the story as you tell it for the United States, other, developed countries is, um, then that women can't
Young,
marry a man in their 20s because either the guy isn't going to college, in which case his prospects are not good, not really,
yeah,
top notch,
yeah.
or he's still in school and it'll be a while before his prospects become absolutely clear.
Right. It's a very messy signal, especially since more and more people go to school. Going to college used to be a pretty strong signal,
Right,
right? It's not as strong a signal anymore. So you're looking for signaling, right? This is a
right.
signaling exercise. So, and I should say, I do want to mention one of the things you mentioned before at the very beginning. Fertility's falling most places, lots and lots of places all around the world, all kinds of different places. And so that leads a lot of people to say, well, country specific stories can't be true, or, very niche stories can't be true. It must be something super, super general. And then a lot of people say, but then we always have, like you said, we always have exceptions. Every story has an exception. Okay. And so I think the fact that all of our sort of unified single variable, unified model theories keep having these exceptions is actually good proof that we should be looking for a story like I'm telling, which is basically multivariate. That for a lot of developing countries, there was kind of this adoption of developmental idealism, change in child mortality. Um, and then for a lot of the high income countries, and actually we see this now in a lot of low income countries as well. I mean, marriage is getting skills bias technical change is happening even in very low income countries as well. Um, but we are seeing now at a lot of different income levels that young men are systematically underperforming. Um, and so they just don't get married until much later, so they don't have as much time to have kids. And I mean, I could point out a ton of evidence on this. We can see that like housing market entrance is really strongly associated with marriage and fertility. When people have better housing access, when young people have better housing access, they are vastly more likely to get married. That is when the price of housing is lower in relationship to um, the typical income
Well,
of
yeah,
the
I would
20-year-old
say
man.
perhaps that the American analogy to developmental idealism is this: you've got to be perfectly settled before you can get married. I
Yeah,
mean,
the capstone
I
notion
mean,
of marriage. Yeah,
during the baby boom,
yeah,
my guess is that the the men, a lot of the men who were married and having children
yeah.
were not nearly as settled economically
No,
as
they were not.
people demand today.
Yeah,
So there's a little bit of an ideology there. It's not just
yeah,
the underlying economics changing, but it's sort of the
yeah.
norm changing.
So there's a great way we can think about culture and uh, like cultural factors and material factors. So think about housing. Let's imagine that people prefer to own a home before they're gonna have kids. Okay, and this is empirically true, but let's stipulate it. And let's just assume that that's an existing cultural norm that's sticky. Okay, now let's imagine that people are going to get married later, so they're going to spend more years single. The kinds of homes that will sell are going to change, right? Because there's going to be more single people on the market for housing, right? So you're going to buy different types of homes, or you're going to rent different types of homes, smaller homes, apartments. So, okay, you're a developer, you say, well, gosh, apartments are what's selling, so I'm going to only build apartments, okay? Well, pretty soon, now the cultural norm is going to be that everybody lives in apartments. And this norm of homeownership maybe changes. And then when that norm of homeownership changes, that shifts the demand curve essentially for housing. And then developers have to respond to that. So
And
when we
then
think about,
you also have this father issue, which is you have people like me still living in a house that can hold a lot of children, and I'm a boomer. I'm
yeah,
retired,
okay,
and
maybe a couple times a year your kids come home for the holidays.
right, and so they see that, and then they can only afford an apartment, and it's
So this is basically a version of the Easterlin hypothesis, right? But I think I would be a slightly modified version here is it's not so much just consumption norms, it's life sequencing norms, right? It's the
yeah,
idea that like it's not that like the consumption potential is so great because actually a lot of these young people's consumption potential is meh. It's not necessarily great, particularly in terms of housing where there's
yeah.
problems. Their consumption potential of like iPhones and pornography is through the roof, but their consumption potential of housing is not so great. Um, but it's a life course issue, right? And life sequencing is a complicated thing to model economically, right? Because it doesn't matter what the price dynamic is with childbearing if you don't have a partner. It's just a coordination problem. It's a threshold effect, right? Um, so uh, the point is culture and economic factors are not separable. They are they're an Ouroboros, right? Like culture creates culture creates tastes and preferences that give the demand curve and to some extent the supply curve its shape. Then you get economic, technological, productivity shifts that alter it again, and demand further responds through
So
shifting
one
cultural.
other thing I want to bring up is that, so there's sort of this decline in intended family size that you attribute to these
Mhm.
two factors. I guess in the United States, it would have to be, well, no, I'll skip that. But then you have the family size falling below even these lower targets.
Mhm.
I think that the story there, and I think you would agree, is that it's like people wait too long
Yes.
to get married and to
Yeah.
have children. And I think part of it is people don't understand what the um, what the biology is. That sort
Yes.
of starting at age 20, you're
Yep.
the quality of the eggs and the sperm is going down.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah, there's a lot of right now actually there is we're kind of living in a golden age of research on people's bad ideas about fertility. Um, there's a lot of survey work that just asks people simple questions of like, you know, when do you think your fertility starts to decline? What day of the month do you think you're most likely to get pregnant if you have sex? Like just basic like how to have a baby questions. And people do really badly on these things. Like they score really low scores on these quizzes. The only people who score well on these quizzes are people with a personal history of infertility and miscarriage, right? So the people who experience infertility learn the facts because it's those facts are making them miserable. Everybody else is just out here hopelessly optimistic. And so there's a real argument that um, we might be able to nudge fertility rates higher simply by requiring like school health classes to have a class that's like how to make a baby instead of like now, which is just how not to make a baby. Like, suppose you wanted a baby, how would you do it? It's not as intuitive as you might think.
okay. Um, Sort of related to this sort of aging sperm and eggs phenomenon, which, so what that means is, some people who get married in their 30s are just more likely to run into fertility problems, right? And more
Yes.
likely to have miscarriages and so on.
Yes.
Here's a speculation on my part, and I don't know if you have any thoughts about it, or you can maybe you can shoot it down, or maybe you can support it. So one of the phenomena that we see is this increase in uh, certain types of disorders among children, ADHD, autism, and so
Mhm.
on. And one line that you'll hear is, "Oh, this isn't, it's not really happening. Arnold, there were just as many of these kids when you were a kid, you just didn't know." And I think that's baloney. I mean, I think
Mhm.
it's real, and I can see that it's a real change.
Mhm.
And you know, people who have been school psychiatrists for 30 years can tell you that there's, it is a real thing. And I mean,
Yep.
the other thing is people on the right will say, "Oh, it's not real. These are just boys who are not being allowed to run around at recess." And again, I don't think that's wrong. I think it's been a real change.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering if anyone can tie that or thinks of tying that to this later pregnancy phenomenon, that you're just getting lower quality sperm and eggs producing these kids, and maybe you're just seeing a lot more sort of disorders that emerge because of that. What is that a
So there,
is anyone looking at that as a cause of this? And what do you think the odds are it is a cause?
so there's there's two different causal arrows here. One is one thing we absolutely do know from massive large scale population studies, from really strong quasi experimental designs involving like sibling effects and stuff like that, and even twin designs and twin studies, is that mental health is extremely anti poor mental health is extremely antinatal. If you've got two twins, and one of them is diagnosed earlier with a mood or behavioral disorder than the other one, they're going to have a lot fewer children. Um, if you've got any indicator of really negative affect or mental or poor mental health, strongly predicts lower fertility, and it predicts both lower rates of marriage and lower fertility within
Okay,
marriage.
but that's not the
So
question. You understand the
right.
question
So
I'm
yeah,
asking?
yeah, 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 no. So I'm doing there's
Right,
two different directions, right?
right.
So one of these is poor mental health is definitely part of the falling fertility issue around the world. One of the vectors for poor mental health is almost certainly social media. And we know this because there are a couple of unique, newly emergent mental illnesses that we know spread on social media because we can find the first person who had this disease, and we find the disease replicated through their social media followers, and then their
Well,
followers
who
follows.
names this disease? Because right, there are all these
Um, the
official
the the first one is
designations.
there's one called TikTok ticks. It was a like a twitching disease that a bunch of kids were getting. They found like the first TikTok account that had it, and then they were able to map out that like it spread through TikTok followers. Um, but other ones like you'll find like, oh, suddenly all the girls in one classroom think that they have this like really rare mental disorder, and you find out that like some social media influencer that was popular with one of them got it first, and then they all decided they had it. But the thing is, it's not just that they decide they have it, they do have it. They start to manifest all of the symptoms of, I mean, this gets to the question of what is a mental illness. I agree with you that there's been a real change. It's not just a shift in diagnosticity. And that so there has been a shift in diagnosis. Like people are more like people of the same symptomaticity have a higher rate of receiving a diagnosis today than in the past, but that is not the whole change. We are seeing incontrovertibly an increase in symptomaticity of almost every mental illness you can think of. However, it also is the case that like most mental illnesses, not all, there are exceptions, something like schizophrenia, okay, but other most mental illnesses are syndromes that are typified and described not based on their etiology, that is their cause, but by their symptoms, right? So if you manifest the symptoms, you have the disease. And the thing about mental illness is, in most cases, there is not a test. There's just the symptoms, which means if all of your friends have the symptoms and you start to develop the symptoms either through conscious emulation or through unconscious emulation, then you have the disease. There was a study that showed recently that they did a randomized controlled trial of school students in, I think, Australia. It was a very large study, it was well powered, of just giving all of the kids mindfulness training, like teaching them to like be more mindful and like observant of their bodies and stuff. That's like supposed to be helpful. And for people who have certain types of mental illness, mindfulness training can, there is some evidence to suggest that it may be helpful. But they found that when they just did it for everyone, it actually increased the rates of some mental illnesses and had no beneficial effect. So what happened is when you convinced all these kids to start asking themselves every day, like, am I mentally ill? A lot of them decided they were.
So you
And
get rumination and
yeah, yeah, yeah. So like you can think of this as similar to like iatrogenic harm. Like
yeah.
you go into the hospital for something and you pick up MRSA. Okay. Like in the same way, like the therapy talk that circulates on social media. Okay, genuine cognitive behavioral therapy or some other credible kind of therapy has real uses that are supported by a lot of evidence, okay, for people who actually have like diagnoses for mental illnesses. But like just inundating all of society with like, what's your disorder? Ooh, I've got this cool one. What do you have? Like we're like collecting illnesses as part of your identity. It's really harmful. And I think there was actually just a recent study as well of,
Just let me interrupt a second.
yeah,
Maybe this is 5 years ago, maybe even longer
yeah,
ago. I had dinner at a with some, really, you know, sort of higher end people that I'm used to hanging around with. And one of them had his children, his son there who was like in like maybe freshman in high school. And he was just saying how, oh, everyone in my school is like LGBTQ or whatever. It just struck me that must be a social phenomenon. It's not
yes.
like,
Yeah, well, and I mean something like yeah, something like LGBT identity. Okay, so human sexuality is like this is like deep in your evolutionary hardware. Like you don't just have a sexually reproducing species and have nothing in your brain that regulates it, right? So, but at the same time, the search for like a gay gene, GWAS studies do not identify very many. They don't explain a lot of the variation. Twin and sibling studies suggest homosexuality is not highly heritable. It's clearly environmental. The search for fetal environmental characteristics doesn't strongly support the notion that it's fetal environment. There may be some fetal environmental effects, but it doesn't seem to be the dominant factor. It is social environment. Now, we don't know exactly which part of the social environment, but it seems very hard to think that your peers around puberty have no effect, right? They clearly have an effect. This is very difficult to like politically say because then it's like, oh, so what are that this doesn't change how you should treat someone, right? Like if they are the way they are and they can't change it as an adult, it doesn't mean you should treat them differently than if it was if it was genetic or something. But the point is, um, uh, yes, humans are highly malleable. Okay, now your question originally was about old sperm. So what do we know about old sperm or old eggs? Um, Rates of most birth defects do rise with age of mother and age of father. Um, There is some evidence that suggests older fathers may, in particular, have higher rates of autism, is the one that I've seen studied. Um, Down syndrome, of course, is much higher for older parents as well. I am not sure if the older father to autism linkage has been subjected to all the most rigorous tests and exploration. I have seen the link in the literature. I do not know the exact robustness of the finding, but I do know that the finding is out there and circulates. Um, so there is that. It's also true that highly educated parents and older parents have incentives to produce diagnoses for their children, particularly if you live in certain states that subsidize diagnosis, right? So it's a classic CDC finding, right? They've got surveillance of autism around the country. And in most states, autistic children have appreciably lower measured IQs than non autistic children. But in one state, autistic children have above average IQs, and that state is California. And the reason why is because California provides a home care subsidy for autistic children. That is, they pay you money if you have autistic children. And they also give lots of educational benefits like extra testing time, all this stuff. More and more states are moving that direction. And as a result, the average IQ of autistic children is rising. Um, so
and
that doesn't,
your view is that that's not a policy result, that's a selection result, right?
I
That
would say that what's going on, yeah,
people
people
are putting
select
taking
people.
high functioning autistic kids or high functioning kids who may not even be autistic and getting the diagnosis.
Yes, so that is clearly diagnosticity. Okay, so that part is also symptomaticity of autism is rising. Okay, so there's two things going on at once. Um, Actually, I should walk that back. I actually don't know if symptomaticity of autism is rising, but I know symptomaticity of anxiety and depression and mood and behavioral disorders is. I don't specifically know if autism symptomaticity is, although I know that there are people who argue that it is. I haven't totally explored that.
I, I believe
But
it is, by the way.
yeah, I mean, I suspect it is.
Yeah.
So.
So let me change gears a little bit and say, um, if you wanted to reverse the fertility decline, which, in the last year, a lot of people have jumped onto that bandwagon who were not on it before. Um,
Yes, it used to be a very lonely cohort of us, but now we're like the hot girl at the dance, apparently.
yeah, really. Yeah, I just saw like Yasha Monk, who's like center left,
I know.
jumping a little on that bandwagon. So if you wanted to do it, your view is you have to change the norms around sort of not delaying marriage so much. And once you get it to see for once you get people marrying in their early 20s, they're not you're pretty much guaranteed you're going to have larger families than if they wait till their 30s. Is that a fair?
Yeah, so I would say that there's there's not really a path to raising fertility without tackling marriage. And I mean, you can look at like um uh what highly high income country still has high fertility. It's Israel. Israel's average age at first marriage is like 6 years younger than the rest of the
Really,
OECD
even
as
though they
well.
go through army and then they travel and then they go to school, they're still
Yeah,
getting.
let me look up what it is. So we're gonna look at women, Israel. It's not as low as I thought. I thought it was like 26. Oh wait, hold on. What's going on? Okay, so what's this? Oh, okay, this is not all countries. Um, so Israel is this data I'm looking at says 29. Europe, if you look in Europe, Spain is 30. Yeah, here we go. Spain is 38, Netherlands is 37, Norway's 37, Ireland's 35. Um, you know, most of Europe is above 30.
Yeah.
Virtually all of Europe. Israel's still below 30. I thought it was more like 27, 28, but they're saying it's 29 maybe. I'll have to check that. But the point is, it's quite a lot
Yeah.
lower. And also, it's not just it's lower, it's more universal. So if you think about it, average age at first marriage is only measured among those who do get married,
Right.
right? Um, so in Israel, the share who eventually get married is much higher. Um,
So the
and so
proportion of women who are not married by
at,
age 30 would be huge in Europe and much less in Israel.
at
Even
any
that
yeah
would be
at
even a bigger gap than it's indicated by the average
yeah
age. Yeah.
yeah at any given age, Israeli women are way more likely to be married than say Italian or French or Swedish women.
And
Um,
what's the story for the United States, out of curiosity?
we also have a pretty rapidly falling marriage rate. Um, our current, what is our current,
Yeah, so the interesting statistic would really be sort of percentage that
currently,
not married by
yeah,
age X.
I have all of that, but not right in front of me.
Okay, no problem.
I'm sure I've got it published somewhere in an article.
Yeah.
Um, but you know what? Actually, I have it in a recent article. Uh, Let me look this up. Lyman Stone, IFS marriage rate. I think I have this within, yeah. Um, okay, yeah, so I can share my screen probably, right? Sharing is not turned on. I will send a request.
I'm going to do allow so you can.
Okay, so this is an article I wrote. When did I write this? Yeah, last February. And this is in the US. These lines at the bottom are males. Women are in purple, men are in blue. These darkest lines are at age 25, the share who are married at 25. You can see that in the 70s, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, whatever, about 80% of women were married by age 25. Today, it's about 20%, just over 20%. If you look all the way up at age 45, it used to be 90%. Today, it's down to about 80%. You can see the biggest decline is a shift in timing. That is, a lot of people who used to get married at 25 now get married by 35. We can see even at the older ages, there's just a
Yeah.
lot more people are never getting married in their reproductive years. I don't know exactly what these lines look like in other countries. Um, I do
But
have,
but if you got the average age of marriage being 35, 36, 38, then
it's going to be, yeah,
yeah, okay.
yeah.
So so
So
that's
then the question is like how you get people to marry more. And I think on this, it's all too easy to think like that we need to forget the desire for a silver bullet.
so
Okay.
if you get
So
desire
like
for what?
for a silver bullet. We're gonna
Okay.
have to do a lot of different things. You know, tackling housing affordability is really important. Tackling marriage penalties. We still have huge marriage penalties in the welfare code. And 20 somethings, again, we talked about 20 something men tend to be not very high income. 20 something men tend to be in the range of welfare phase outs, which means there are people who face marriage penalties if they marry a similar earning person, which the woman they would marry would be similar earning. So we are literally paying 20 somethings not to get married through our welfare code. You also want to look at things, you want to look at cultural norms. There are maybe ways to nudge cultural norms, but I think we could explicitly subsidize marriage. Like, I think we could just say marriage is really good for society. It has good effects on people's criminality, on their drug use, on all sorts of things we care about. Also, like 95% of people say they want to be married. Um, it's clear that financial reasons are a reason people don't get married. Financial stresses are a major cause of divorce. Let's just subsidize marriage. Like, why not? We already do for high earning people by basically having tax brackets structured in such a way that a high earning person with a low earning spouse gets a huge tax break. Let's just let's just stop subsidizing it only for high earning people. Let's just subsidize marriage. Let's just pay people to get married. Why not?
Can I interrupt and let John
Yeah.
unmute himself and ask his question?
I hope I hope I'm not interrupting. It's been a
No, please.
great conversation, and I've learned a lot. Thank you. So I want to encourage you with your work. But one item that hasn't come up that I want to know if you think this could be a substantial cause of the decrease in fertility in, say, the United States. Uh, if I understand correctly, there are two substantial empirical trends. One is that the graduation rate, higher educational attainment for women has surpassed that of men.
Yep.
Roughly 1970, roughly 60% of college degrees were men and 40% were women. That's roughly flipped now and growing, if I understand correctly. And the other trend, if I understand correctly, is greater prevalence of uh, assortative mating by educational attainment, meaning that people tend more now than they
Yep.
used to marry at their education level.
Yep.
You put these two trends together, it means that there are a lot of educated women who don't want to marry down in their eyes.
Yeah.
And how big a factor is that? So we're back to the
Yeah.
beginning of the conversation was education.
Yeah.
So this is just one piece of it that, my intuition,
Yeah.
I'm not an expert, I just try and keep up on
Yep.
this.
Yep.
My intuition is that this is an important piece of the puzzle, and that's one thing we haven't touched on. So anything you might, and however which way you might address that, thank you.
Yeah, you're totally correct on both trends. Women are outperforming men in school. And people are increasingly mating assortatively on education. However, as it happens, most of the decline in marriage is among less educated people, like non-college educated people. For college educated women, their marriage rates have only declined a little bit, not a lot. Um, Eventually they find a guy who um, uh, meets whatever standard there may be. Um, Largely because eventually the men tend to do okay, or the women eventually realize they really want family, and that that involves a guy.
Oh, you
Um,
said, you said eventually, so here we're back,
Eventually, yes.
the
So there's
graph
a
that,
delay issue. Yeah,
the graph
yeah,
that you put, so,
yeah.
you're still marrying too late to have
Yes. So it makes it harder.
children
Yeah. So the
because of the same
decline, yeah.
dynamic.
But again, the biggest decline in fertility has been among lower income people, not higher income. And I should say, when I say lower income, I don't even mean like time varying. I mean like lifetime income. We can look across cohorts. That is, most of the decline in marriage and fertility is among lower socioeconomic status people, not higher. So I do think there's a problem with like kind of college assortative mating. Um, but it actually seems like higher socioeconomic status people basically get around this. Um, they do have some delay, which I think we want to try and help address that. Um, but they are mostly successful in getting around it, and their fertility rates have not fallen that much. It used to be that low educated people had a lot more babies than high educated people. That's not true anymore. Today, fertility is similar across most educational levels for the most recently completed cohorts. And I think for people my age who are like in their 30s right now, I think by the time we are done having kids, we will find that higher educated people actually had more children than lower educated people. I think that's where it's going to end up, at least among whites. It might not be so among other races. Um, so, and I've got a bunch of published stuff on that. I can pull one up right here. I've written so much on that question that at this point, the think tank I write for has forbidden me from writing further on it. Um, so I can pull up just a graph showing how this has changed over time, but now my internet is going slow. I'm hoping you all can hear me. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. My internet is moving really slow on my other thing. Let me pull up. I can show you a graph of how fertility is changing over time. Okay, so I can share screen again. This is going to be a graph of completed fertility by decadal birth cohort. This is the gap between college educated and high school graduates in completed fertility by race. So the blue line is non-Hispanic white. So you can see for women born in the 19 teens, there is no difference between college educated and high school educated women. Now, there were not a lot of college educated women born in the 19 teens. Um, then we can see for women born in the 1940s, there was a big gap, non-Hispanic white women, that college educated women had way fewer children, 0.4 fewer children, which is quite a large gap in a low fertility society. But for women born in the 1970s, the gap is quite small again. You can see the trend is a bit different by different races. It was way more severe for non-Hispanic Black, non-Hispanic Asian. It's kind of like this. It's still, for Hispanics, there's still a big gap that might be driven by foreign-born Hispanics. And for other and multiracial, it's just kind of a crapshoot because that category keeps changing what it is. The point is, we now see not a lot of not nearly as much stratification by education. We can also look at lifetime earnings. That's Black. That's interesting. That graph is not the right graph for that picture. They have done something wrong. It's Hispanic. So we can look at white men and women. It's probably, this is lifetime earnings. So for this, because a lot of women step out of the workforce when they have a child, it's probably best to look at men. This blue line is men born 1979 to 1985 who were surveyed. Their latest survey round was in 2021. This is their lifetime earnings up to that point. You can see the higher earning the man, the more babies he's had by that time. In this cohort, this is from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, by the way. This red line is men born 1956 to 1962 as of 2020. You can see it's a less steep gradient. So actually, for men, higher income men have much higher fertility than lower income men now for like my generation, at least among whites. For non-whites, this is Hispanics. You can see it's not quite as clear. And for
Can you go back to the other one to the whites because I
Yeah.
don't know that I have the bandwidth to absorb a whole lot more of this data.
yeah.
Um,
So this
so you're saying for a younger generation, the
the
gradient
blue
is
line.
steeper.
Yeah.
So the so and
So if you look at the
and
red,
so one of your lines is that marriage and fertility are very highly correlated. So
Mhm.
to me, that says that the higher income males are more marriageable. Is
yes, exactly.
that's
Exactly.
kind
That's exactly right.
of
Yeah, whereas the lower income men are not very marriageable.
yeah.
And so they have very low fertility. But you can see here, if you compare these two cohorts, people born 1956 to 1962 versus people born 1979 to 1985, you compare these two cohorts, you can see higher income men have really not had much decline. Right? This is a very modest decline in fertility. But lower income men, holy cow, there's a big decline. Now, for women, it's complicated by the fact that they step out of the workforce, right? So we actually see a very similar gradient for women. And obviously, the women with the highest earnings have the least children because if you have a lot of children, you tend to step out of the workforce. So no surprise. Yeah, so I think that kind of speaks to that question about gradients. Yeah. John, you have another question up.
Yeah.
If I may, I wouldn't want the conversation to end without this question. So part of what's going on is technology shock in the
Yeah.
sense that women can control their birth rate much more reliably now, whether it's preventive contraception or abortion. And so that technology shock was in the 1960s, say,
Mhm.
70s. So my question is, might we've talked about subsidizing marriage, other policy ideas. Question that arises: might new technology shock be what restores the birth rate? I have in mind, for example, designer babies. If new technology allows people to tailor the genetic traits of their children. Now, this might just be fantasy, but
Yeah, but there are, I don't think
But
you
it's
have to
worth
limit
considering.
yourself to that. There are all sorts of potential
Yeah. So
technologies,
yeah, and
so
I've actually
will
just
technology
IVF.
provide the solution?
yeah, that's a great question. It's a very intuitive question. So first on the contraception side, we do have a perception, I think most of us, that low fertility is because of contraception. The problem with this story is that below replacement rate fertility first began to appear in Europe in the 19th century. And I mean, there were U.S. states that were under two children, under 2.1 children in the 1920s. So Japan has its first fertility transition in the late 1500s and early 1600s. And then they see a huge fertility increase in the 1800s. It's due to some cultural and policy stuff. I won't belabor it too much, but the point is, contraception was invented when it was because of specific demand. Okay. Archaeologists will tell you that we have found dildos and condoms from ancient Egypt. People have known how to not have babies for a very long time. There are lots of ways that you can have a good time with another person and not have a baby. So And we have many, many historical societies that have experienced fertility transitions. Um, and it's typically occurs alongside emergent norms that basically change the attitudes towards sex, marriage, and children. I won't belabor that too much, but the key point is contraceptives are definitely a part. They've definitely helped speed the spread of small family norms because they did make it quite easy. But they they turn out to have shockingly little statistical power when you try to put together a large enough data set. Now, on the other side, reproductive technology bailing us out. My thought is yes and no. So one problem is that most of the cost of having children is in the rearing parts, not the bearing part. That is, we know from there's a lot of studies of motherhood penalties, like what happens to women's income when they have a baby. And what we know is whether they have the baby biologically or via adoption, they have the same motherhood penalty. Okay, that is, women's incomes fall the same whether they adopt a baby or have a baby through just gestating it. So that part of the cost of raising a child is invariant based on new reproductive technology. Um, we also know that when IVF goes from very expensive to totally free, and there's a lot of places in the world where it is close to free because of various insurance coverage rules or public subsidies, that it has essentially no effect on the birth rate. We have a lot of places that have
That's
done
even
this.
though the rate of IVF has been going way up.
Yes, yes. Because what happens is, and you can see this now, companies advertise to their young women workers that we pay for egg freezing. So what happens? People know that they can have babies later in life, so they kick the can down the road more, right? So what you see when IVF becomes very cheap is you again, I actually have a paper where I review the literature on this. We actually do observe first birth rates for young women decline faster, and then we see first birth rates for older women rise. And what's going on is people are just shifting their first births later, and there's no net effect.
Okay, so the awareness of these technologies kind of reduces birth, other things equal.
Well, the
And then
subsidy.
the existence of the technology presumably brings it back.
No, so
Limited.
it's essentially the cost dynamic, right? These technologies are expensive. Um, and so when they become freely available, is generally when we study it. And there's not really a way to study the existence of the technology because it came into existence everywhere all at once. We can only study cost of it. Um, and what we observe is that when it becomes essentially free, that it has no effect on fertility.
Well, I'd say it's I what I picture is a 25-year-old woman saying, "Oh, well, I don't have to get married now. I'll be able to use this." Then they get to 35 and they find out what's involved and
Yes, it's less
torment
pleasant than you might think.
and the torment they're going to have to go through, and they say, maybe not."
Well, I mean, egg freezing isn't a walk in the park in its own right. I mean, just even that side of it. So, that's part of it. Now, I will say, although I am definitely on the skeptic side of the idea that like IVF will save us, or that like artificial wombs will save us, I don't. I'm very skeptical of these for a lot of different reasons. There are avenues for technological innovation that I think are promising. So, for example, um, a lot of people experience miscarriages. A lot of people experience recurrent miscarriages. This is becoming more common because miscarriage is age related, and more people are trying to have kids later. Um, and there is surprisingly little research into preventing miscarriage, which is strange since we know that a very large share of miscarriages are preventable. That is, they are not due to like genetic abnormalities, chromosomal deficiencies, or fundamental inability to carry a child. They're often due to blood clotting issues that get more common with age, immune related issues that get more common with age, or various comorbidities that get more common with age. And it so happens that sometimes we find drugs that have off-label usages that help reduce miscarriage. So there are certain conditions that if you have them and you supplement with progesterone, you can prevent a pregnancy loss. There are other conditions that if you have them and you get like a small molecule heparin, so like usually something like enoxaparin, you can greatly reduce odds of miscarriage. And the thing about miscarriage prevention is if somebody's having recurrent miscarriages, it's because they want kids. Okay. Nobody has their sixth miscarriage accidentally. It's like, oh, shucks. Whoops. No, you did that because you're trying to have a baby. This is an avenue where people are suffering harms. That is, they are having painful and unpleasant experiences while trying to have kids. So these are people that want to have kids. We know that the failure to have kids here for them is not cost, right? It's literally physical inability, okay? That the kid is dying. So if we could prevent miscarriage, if we could save that healthy child, then we get more babies. I did some back of the envelope math. If all we did was treat everyone who's had a miscarriage who tries to conceive again, if we just preventatively treated them with enoxaparin, which is already a widely available medication, it sells as Lovenox for the pregnancy-related formulation of it. If all we did was just treat everyone who's had a miscarriage with enoxaparin, we would plausibly in the US get somewhere between 20 and 100,000 more births a year. Now, that's like 0.3% higher births. Okay.
You
But
go
that's
from
what,
so it would go from like, 1.8 to 2.1 or something like that.
no. It'd go from like 1.8 to 1.81. Okay.
Oh,
This is a very small effect,
okay.
but it's one drug. Okay. Like, this is my point. There's no silver bullet, but it's amazing if you could get tens of thousands more babies with one drug.
Yeah.
Okay. Like, and I will say, I have multiple people that I've talked to. They were like, oh, yeah, we've had a bunch of miscarriages. Our doctor doesn't know what to do. And I'm like, well, has your doctor read the literature on enoxaparin? Because it's a rapidly growing literature. It's an old drug that only started to be used for pregnancy in the last few years. Have they tried it? Oh, no. Okay, you should talk to your doctor, see what they think. If they think you're a good candidate, try it. There's like 3 babies in the world, 4, but not counting my kids, who I know about this because of personal history. Not counting my kids, there are 3 other babies in the world because I was like, did you talk to your doctor about enoxaparin? Okay, like, my point is not that one drug will solve the fertility crisis. My point is medical innovation could probably give us 100 different drugs on this front. Enoxaparin only treats a small range of these things. Better identification of folate related deficiencies is important. If we can get hipsters to stop eating sea salt and go back to iodized salt, we could probably prevent some miscarriages. Why? Because iodine deficiency is a common cause of miscarriage. If we can get hipsters to eat folate strengthened bread instead of their like homemade no folate bread, we could prevent some miscarriages. Okay, like they're all little things, but my point is there are some fundamental forces pushing against fertility. Skills bias technical change is not going to go away. Okay, it's just going to be hard for young men to signal that they're good marriage candidates. We can try and push on it some, we can do subsidies, but we can't rewrite the whole economy. The economy is what it is on some level. I mean, there are reasons it is the way it is. But we can make 100 different little nudges materially and culturally. And in so doing, we can create conditions where we get closer to Israel, okay, where you have a high income society with high birth rates.
Okay, well, that sounds like a concluding note, but I want to give people just a few seconds if anyone wants to raise a hand. If not, I think I will call that a.
Just a second. There was a question from the Substack guy. He said, "Isn't the fertility decline actually U-shaped?" I don't know if that graph showed that or not, but he had a different hypothesis than the one that you were sharing.
I can show probably I know what graph he's thinking about. I can pull it up in like 2 seconds. He's thinking of this graph that I will show. Here we go. He's thinking of a version of this graph right here. Total fertility rate by income group.
Right. So that's
Yeah.
probably what he's.
Yeah. The problem is this graph is wrong.
Okay.
It's not that it's miscalculated. It's that you have to think about what a total fertility rate is. It's sum to age-specific fertility rates for a given population, a synthetic cohort. But the people who fall in the 100,000 income range are not the same age on average as the people who fall in the 25 to 49,000 range. Likewise, the I can go, actually, this entire blog post here is about why that graph is wrong. But actually, the more polished version of it is these posts I did that I did as part of the initiative at these called More Money, More Babies. I did 3 posts, actually, I think 4 posts on this. No, I did 3 posts and then I did one on dysgenic fertility, where I reviewed all the evidence on what we know about socioeconomic stratification of fertility in high income societies. It's basically, the long and short of it is that graph is a kind of statistical illusion that comes from cultural stratification and from age stratification of the data. Once you control for that, nothing. And you get the graphs I showed from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, where it's just a line up by men's income, and for women's income, it's complicated. It's a very complicated story for women's income, what's going on. It depends on the type of income and all that sort of stuff. But it's it's a common perception. It's one a lot of people are familiar with. It's not correct today. But it's a very reasonable people have that. And also I will say, it's a graph that shares really well. You show people that graph and they're like, yeah, that's what's happening. It's like all the welfare moms and the rich people and us middle class people are suffering. It's a very relatable graph. It's certainly how I feel. But it turns out not to be correct.
So what it's picking up is that people have higher incomes in their 40s and 50s than in their 20s and 30s.
Yeah, it's picking up a range of different sources of stratification.
All right, so thanks very much. This has been I had high expectations and this has exceeded them. So thanks a lot, Lyman, and I will stop the recording.